Stephen Harp will be presenting a paper entitled North Africans, Mass Tourism, and the Rebuilding of the French Riviera, Police Files from the Provinces. Stephen is a distinguished professor of history and professor of French at the University of Akron. Stephen's work includes Learning to be Loyal, Primary Schooling as Nation Building in Alsace and Lorraine from 1998, Marketing Michelin, Advertising and Cultural Identity in 20th Century France from 2001, Eau Naturelle, Naturism, Nudism, and Tourism in 20th Century France from 2014, and most recently, A World History of Rubber, Empire, Industry, and the Everyday from 2016. He's currently working on a project entitled Mediterranean Migrations and the Remaking of the French Riviera, Tourism and Socio-Environmental Transformations in Post-War France. Thank you, Stephen.
For reasons of time, rather than talk briefly about the chapter, I ran it off. I'm sorry for the lack of son et lumière. It's really very rudimentary. I first met John at the Western meeting that Tyler Stovall organized at the Salon in 1999. We ate, or hoped to eat, as was pointed out this morning, at large tables and lingered over meals. One morning after breakfast, John, this doyen of historians of France, came up to me, introduced himself, and told me he'd found my book on Alsace, the only one I'd written, really useful. Since I hadn't already met John, I didn't realize just how typical that experience has been for many of us. John was and is so incredibly collegial and encouraging. I'm happy to be here presenting this paper in honor of him and to be privileged to be his friend. This is the current outline that's passing around with way too much alliteration. If I spent the amount of time writing that I spend thinking of titles for things, I would be prolific. It's on a book on the social and environmental changes wrought by mass tourism on the post-war Riviera. At the moment, my materials seem to dictate a series of chapters on what might be called the modernization, or what used to be called that, of the post-war Riviera, and then a strong closing chapter on the hygienic crusade against habitat insalubre, specifically the squats and shantytowns inhabited mostly by North African laborers with attention to their experience. As it turns out, since up to 85% of North Africans were employed in construction in Alpes-Maritimes, occupying critical, unskilled, and semi-skilled positions, much of the literal rebuilding of the Riviera, tracked in the first 5 chapters, was actually done by North African workers. Clearly, I am joining other scholars now working to complicate the Trente Glorieuses, writing about not only the marked transformation of the environment, but also its impact on the North African laborers who made it possible. I should note in passing that Jean Forestier's Trente Glorieuses neglects the topic of labor migration altogether, as if the transformation of post-war France was not also fundamentally imperial and especially post-colonial. At first glance, this paper may not seem close to the emphases of John's research, in part because it had to be whacked from 15 pages to 8 pages. I'll still get it into the time allotted. But it has several important connections that reveal the impact of John's influence on so many of us. First, this study is based very heavily in records from departmental archives, in this case particularly Alpes-Maritimes, where I spent several months, as John would say, getting my hands dirty. And I've only worked in about a dozen departmental archives myself. But they have real use in that it's the place where everything from, as almost everybody in this room knows, I think, where everything from the commune goes national and everything national goes to the commune. And it gives us a kind of level of granular detail that's often missing from municipal archives because of the unevenness of the quality of collections and classement. Second, though the categorization of my most interesting files is more often marked, they're more often titled Habitat Insalubre or Bidonville, police records within those files are very critical. They may not be as varied as John has so often used, but they're essential. Throughout the period I'm focusing on, that is from 1945 to 1976, as part of the process of expulsion of inhabitants of squats and shantytowns, police counted the number of inhabitants, listed their names, listed their hometowns, and listed their employers. Moreover, police told the history of occupation of the space in question, described any resistance or reluctance of inhabitants to move on, and sometimes noted where those evicted were likely to go next. Reading between the lines of their reports and those of the prefect's staff, I found interesting stories of the men, and in some cases women and children, who lived in the squats and shantytowns of the Riviera. Like so many of us trained in social history, but now pursuing it with an attention for cultural and linguistic categories, I remain especially interested in the lives of those otherwise without voice in the historical record. And and certainly unmentioned in the various popular histories, and there are way too many of those, published about the rich and famous in the Riviera frolicking around. Given the post-war housing shortage, squats were widespread in post-war France, particularly on the Riviera, where so many villas had been vacant during the war and where they were slated for destruction after the war. The landscape of Western Nice was utterly transformed after 1945 as large apartment blocks replaced the villas and gardens of the 19th and early 20th century elite. As builders tore down those abandoned buildings, squats mostly disappeared, replaced by larger shantytowns. In one sense, there was a fine line between a squat and a shantytown, as most shantytowns began as a squat in an abandoned building. Then other workers moved onto the property, built some more housing from materials they could get from their work sites, and so on. In another sense, there was a cultural divide between a squat and a shantytown in that the latter were always called bidonville, at least in Alpes-Maritimes, suggesting their imperial origin since the term originated in North Africa. The Riviera, and Nice in particular, was very much a post-colonial space with numerous pieds noirs who got priority for housing while bidonvilles were populated by Maghrébins. There was a significant North African presence on the Riviera, where thousands lived in bidonville for several years, from the early 1960s to the mid-1970s. The last large bidonville in France, at Digue des Français, that is along the Var River, was in Nice, and it was not raised until 1976. So while the number and extent of bidonvilles never rivaled those of Ile-de-France, Marseille, or Lyon, they were not irrelevant on the Riviera, particularly not in Nice. Now, in a move that I hope John would appreciate, I want to tell you some stories about these North Africans' acuity in finding and keeping housing and resisting, whenever they could, expulsions. Bidonvilles were well known for their tar paper shacks as these materials were low cost or free from building sites, which makes them seem obvious building materials given that the workers had access to them. Perhaps an early counterexample would help to prove the point. Interestingly, in 1958, the civilian administrator charged with Affaire Musulmane in Alpes-Maritimes noted in a report from the prefect to the Ministry of the Interior that the early bidonville near the airport, that at the early bidonville, or in the early bidonville at the airport, near the new airport of Nice, Algerians who had some hope that they might remain in place for some time were, quote, reproducing the atmosphere of their village in Algeria, having constructed several small buildings of stone of the traditional type, unquote. We'll leave the loaded language aside, but the stone, I think, is important. These dwellings were along, quote, a small street where one can quite naturally find a Moorish cafe and a doner kebab cellar, unquote. Soon that bidonville was raised, and as North Africans were pushed from one property to another, over time it clearly made more sense to invest much less time and money in building their dwellings. But the widespread assumption that North Africans preferred or were only capable of makeshift tar paper shacks was, of course, a force of circumstance, not one of preference or capacity. The men worked in construction and exercised more skill in building than most men possessed. And in the early years, their use of stone over wood indicates what the men could have built if they'd had control of land. Abundant files concerning bidonville also reveal that North Africans sometimes pushed back against constant efforts to remove them from a given property. In the late 1950s, Algerians working in France reminded authorities that they too were supposed to be French citizens. In 1958, when the prefecture and the mayor's office worked to expel a dozen Algerian Muslims, as well as some Armenians from a property on the Avenue Gravier in the neighborhood of Saint-Maurice, so that a new HLM could be built, the Algerians reminded police of their French nationality and refused to be expelled without due process, as the not yet naturalized Armenians had just been. Without a legal procedure of expulsion, the Algerians correctly analyzed attempts to tear down the old mill and two buildings they had been occupying as illegal actions, and threatened the workers sent in to destroy the structures, causing the workers to leave the construction site. The situation was doubly usual and ironic for the Algerians. They were to be expelled so that an HLM could be built on the site where they would be working to build it. But in 1958, no North Africans in Nice were eligible to live in HLM. Moreover, as the police report itself attested, property owners, including hotel owners, refused categorically to rent to North Africans. The 12 Algerians whose employers could not be cajoled into providing housing were temporarily transferred to the small buildings surrounded the Château du Comté de Falicon, another property owned by the Office Municipal des HLM, that would be destroyed later, and they'd be pushed off that property as well. The pattern was familiar to them. When expelled, they sought out other abandoned properties in which to find shelter. The only difference this time was that the authorities offered assistance in locating new shelter in return for North Africans' acceptance of the eviction. North Africans worked the system as best they could. On October 25th, 1960, a man with the apparent aristocratic particule de, I'm not even using his, we're being recorded, and anything subject to derogation, I'm not going to use those names. Anyway, he wrote the prefect, demanding that North African workers be removed from the second dilapidated villa on his property, some 4,500 square meters, behind the Lonval, that's the property, not the building, behind the Lonval Hospital, about 90 meters from the Promenade des Anglais. A dozen North Africans had moved into the villa just 2 weeks prior. The owner approached the North Africans, whom he called les Arabes, explained his opposition to their presence and told them to leave. When they refused, he called the police. The police had intervened 6 months prior, when North Africans had earlier occupied the space. But having expelled them once, here they were again. The police returned, and all parties then went to the police station, where a formal complaint was filed, and the police told the man that the Arabs had been ordered to leave. However, this time they refused and stayed. The man complained to the prefecture, "These Arabs cut off my gas line, flattening the pipe so that I could not repair it myself. Then they prohibited me from entering the villa they now designate as theirs, not even allowing us to move around on the grounds of the property that they occupy on their days off. They clearly consider themselves at home and are threatening. One of them even threatened to kill a worker who came to work for us the other day." Unquote. The police examined the situation for the prefect, discounting the man's claim that the North Africans were threatening. The commissaire noted that he had begun to expel the squatters and that they requested imprisonment in order to gain public attention for their plight. Since a visit from de Gaulle to Nice was impending, the commissaire admitted that he avoided arresting the North Africans. There were extenuating circumstances too, as one of the 5 was a veteran, having served as a colonial parachutist and was recently honorably discharged. In short, a public relations disaster had he been imprisoned. The commissaire noted that the villa had been unoccupied for 6 whole years, implying that there was no reason North Africans should not live there, at least temporarily. Interestingly, the prefect blamed the man for not having secured the enclosure to his property well enough. So, at least for now, for a few months, the North Africans won. As much as any place in Alpes-Maritimes, the bidonville of the Domaine d'Oliveto embodied the many ironies of post-war development on the Riviera. In yet another example, the laborers who literally rebuilt the post-war Riviera, in this case the numerous new apartment blocks in long-time fashionable areas, lived where they could until forced to move. In the mid-1960s, the bidonville d'Oliveto was one of the largest bidonvilles in Alpes-Maritimes, located at the base of the Cimier Hill, long a ritzy section of town, most often associated with the Hôtel Regina, where Queen Victoria had stayed in the Belle Époque. As early as 1959, North African laborers employed on numerous nearby construction sites moved into a dilapidated villa on the grounds. The owner, Abraham Stokind, resided instead at the Hôtel Negresco and died in 1964, and yet more shanties sprang up near the villa. In 1965, North Africans brought in former moving containers as well. By 1966, the prefecture estimated that 450 North African laborers lived on the property. Neighbors complained vehemently to the police, to the prefect, and to the vice president of the National Assembly, creating a record as police, city, and departmental officials investigated. The, quote, lack of hygiene, unquote, caused pestilential odors so bad that neighbors could no longer have dinner on our terraces. The presence of North African men meant that women and children no longer dare go out at night. They steal water in order to wash on the Boulevard Cimier, and on Sundays we have to look at their half-dirty wash hanging in the trees and bushes bordering on the Avenue du Docteur Ménard. On Sunday morning, July 25th, still a quote, on Sunday morning, July 25th, one could confirm that 3 of these individuals, who thought themselves still at home in their douar, were in full underwear, in full view of all, in their underwear in full view of all. Clearly, the notion that North Africans were inherently dirty, indecent, threatening, coincided here with the fact that even their efforts to get water, wash, and clean their clothing were seen as inadequate, even if they were Herculean in reality. Perhaps most ironic was the juxtaposition of tourists' scant apparel on the beach in the year 1964, because it was in 1964 on the beach at Nice that topless sunbathing on the part of women became legal. And men often wore bathing briefs that English speakers like to call Speedos. The difference was, of course, that North African male bodies were held to be inherently threatening, therefore doubly menacing when clothed only in underwear. The neighbors needn't have worried. The city of Nice had its eye on the property, the same city that refused to give land to build HLM throughout the 1960s. Among the city's many efforts to maintain its status as a tourist destination, Mayor Jean Médecin wanted Nice to be the site for the new National Museum dedicated to the works of Marc Chagall, notably the famous Message Biblique. While authorities could do nothing about the bidonville until Solkin's estate was settled, thereafter it expropriated the land and worked with the prefecture to eliminate the shantytown. Most residents accepted their plight and left before the destruction. Some 12 recalcitrants waited until the police cleared the bidonville on August 12th, were harangued in Arabic, and left their dwellings, that is by someone working for the police, and left their dwellings just before the fire began, then stood around to watch the destruction. After a final check to be sure that the shanties were empty and animal control removed a few cats, firemen set things on fire at 6:45 a.m. By noon, the controlled fire had removed the bidonville. The city secured the area so that shanties could not be rebuilt. Fire, which is something we need to talk about afterward, was held in this case to be more hygienic than simply razing with bulldozers, as the dust was seen somehow as unhygienic. This is happening at the same time that vigilantes were setting bidonville on fire in Alpes-Maritimes and elsewhere in France. So there's something that I have not explored sufficiently that I need to as regards fire. The Ministry of Culture immediately undertook the construction of the Musée Chagall, which opened on Easter weekend in 1973. As was the case with the other construction projects to encourage tourism to the post-war Riviera, the importance of North African laborers has gone unnoticed. In this case, the lack of acknowledgement is particularly ironic, since the museum today displays the document indicating that the city of Nice donated the land for the museum, but there is no mention of the fact that hundreds of North African laborers were expelled from that space just before construction. Obviously, there were limits to the power North Africans could hope to assert. But I think there is ample evidence to argue that their actions were both logical and rational, as they faced a largely irrational situation when you think about it, in which their labor was critical to the rebuilding of the Riviera, including housing for tourists and for others, but there was no place for them to live. I won't belabor the point with a conclusion that repeats what I just said at the outset. As you no doubt have figured out by this point, Kristen Ross's Fast Cars, Clean Bodies, which linked the presumed modernization of post-war France with a certain forgetting of the empire and decolonization, is for me a much more useful point de départ for understanding post-war France than Forestier's Trente Glorieuses. Though we need John's level of detail and specificity the minute we put down Kristen Ross's work. You know, it needs to be complementary. I want to thank so much Rachel and Miranda for putting this together, for inviting me to participate, and I want to thank John for being John.